Case 1. Joel Osteen. From the moment you step into the former NBA arena that now houses Lakewood Church, the sheer scale tells you this is not just a religious gathering, it is an empire. Tens of thousands pack the seats, hands raised toward the ceiling as soft lights sweep across the vast auditorium, and millions of viewers at home tune in as if attending a global broadcast event. The transformation of this arena into the nation's largest megachurch didn't happen overnight. It was the product of a sensational rise, a shift that began when Joel Osteen, once a quiet media director working behind the scenes, stepped into the spotlight and turned his father's modest church into one of the most financially powerful ministries in the world. The roar of the crowd, the polished stage, the seamless production, the meticulously choreographed worship experience. Every detail hints at the colossal revenue machine operating behind the inspiration. Joel Osteen's story looks almost accidental from the outside. For years, he wasn't the preacher, the visionary, or the one delivering Sunday messages. He was the quiet son, managing the cameras, editing broadcasts, and shaping the visual identity of Lakewood. Then, in 1999, his father, John Osteen, the church's founder, passed away unexpectedly. Joel stepped into the pulpit almost reluctantly, yet something shifted instantly. His soft, affirming tone and message of positivity drew people in from every direction. Attendance exploded. Broadcast ratings climbed, and in a matter of years, Lakewood Church was no longer simply a Houston congregation. It became a global brand. That brand expanded fast. Joel's sermons were syndicated across major networks, reaching countries far beyond the U.S. His books hit bestseller lists repeatedly, selling in the millions and bringing enormous visibility and revenue to the ministry. At Lakewood, the staff grew into the hundreds. The operating budget soared to levels unheard of for a single church. And then came the boldest expansion of all, purchasing and renovating the former Compaq Center, once home to the Houston Rockets, and transforming it into a massive worship complex. The renovation alone cost tens of millions, funded through church resources and contributions from an ever-growing follower base. But once the doors opened, Lakewood wasn't just a church anymore. It was a worldwide headquarters for broadcasts, conferences, merchandise, music, and constant media production. As Lakewood's influence skyrocketed, scrutiny followed. Critics accused Osteen of promoting a prosperity-style gospel that equated faith with financial abundance. Others questioned the transparency of Lakewood's finances, pointing out the luxurious lifestyle Joel and his family enjoyed outside the pulpit. Controversies arose whenever Lakewood made headlines, whether over financial decisions, public relations missteps, or debates about theology. And each time the conversation circled back to the same point. This church was operating on a scale few religious institutions had ever reached. Millions flowed through its doors every year, funding productions, facilities, and global outreach, and critics argued that the line between ministry and business had blurred beyond recognition. But the controversies never slowed Lakewood's momentum. Even in moments of backlash, Joel maintained his characteristic calm, focusing on messages of hope, emotional uplift, and the power of positive thinking. And for many, that was enough. His influence remained intact, his broadcasts continued to draw massive audiences, and his ministry kept expanding, shaping the image of what a modern megachurch could look like. By the time Lakewood reached peak visibility, Joel Osteen had become one of the most recognizable religious figures on the planet. A pastor whose empire rivaled corporate operations in scale, reach, and financial power. Whether celebrated as a beacon of encouragement or criticized as a symbol of commercialized faith, his impact on megachurch culture is undeniable. He changed the economic landscape of American Christianity, setting a blueprint for ministries built not only on spiritual messages but on branding, marketing, media control, and global influence. And in doing so, Joel Osteen carved out a place as the face of a new era, an era where a church could be every bit as massive, profitable, and influential as a multinational enterprise. Welcome to Savage Case Files, the home of deep-dive true crime documentaries, religious exposés, and the hidden stories powerful institutions pray you never hear. If you're drawn to investigations that peel back the polished surface and reveal the machinery underneath, the money, the influence, the betrayals, the unbelievable truths, then take a moment to subscribe. This channel brings you tightly crafted, deeply researched episodes every day, and your support helps us keep exposing the stories that have shaped millions of lives. Case 2. Bishop T.D. Jakes. The sheer scale of Bishop T.D. Jakes's world becomes clear the moment viewers step into the Potter's House in Dallas, a sprawling campus that feels less like a church and more like a spiritual metropolis. 10,000 seats stretch across the sanctuary. Screens glow with cinematic precision, and thousands of people surge through the halls every weekend as if attending a major cultural event rather than a Sunday service. Jakes doesn't enter the stage quietly. He arrives like a man who understands he's at the helm of a billion-dollar movement in the making. From the first moments of his sermons, the weight of his presence fills the room, a preacher whose voice alone could shift an atmosphere. It's this blend of emotional power, strategic thinking, and unstoppable ambition that transformed him from a small-town pastor into one of the most influential religious leaders on earth. His rise began in West Virginia, where he pastored a congregation so small it barely filled a living room. But Jakes carried a gravitational pull, something that drew broken people, desperate people, hopeful people straight toward him. When he moved to Dallas in the mid-1990s, his trajectory changed forever. The Potter's House exploded almost immediately, swelling from a few hundred to thousands, then tens of thousands, as Jakes became a national sensation through televised preaching, best-selling books, and the Woman Thou Art Loosed movement. People didn't just come for sermons, they came for an experience, one wrapped in music, emotion, tears, and transformation. This emotional connection became the foundation of an empire. What followed was one of the most impressive expansions ever seen in American ministry: multi-million-dollar conferences, a thriving music label, real estate developments, a global humanitarian arm, and even major Hollywood films produced under his name. Jakes built partnerships in television, publishing, and entertainment, becoming a brand that commanded massive financial power. His events sold out stadiums, his books topped charts, his organization employed hundreds. Revenue streams multiplied until the Potter's House stood toe-to-toe with America's largest megachurches. But with an empire that large, scrutiny is unavoidable. Critics question the ministry's wealth, the secrecy of some financial structures, and the enormous profits from books and films developed through religious influence. Prosperity-style undertones in some sermons sparked debate, with detractors accusing Jakes of blending spiritual authority with entrepreneurial ambition. Yet even in controversy, Jakes remained steady, insisting his success was the result of hard work, media innovation, and a commitment to uplifting communities. Today, Bishop T.D. Jakes stands as a symbol of what happens when spiritual influence meets business acumen. His empire rewrote the blueprint for modern ministry, proving that a preacher could become a global powerhouse, one whose reach extends far beyond the pulpit and deep into the engines of American culture, finance, and entertainment. Case 3. Creflo Dollar. From the moment Creflo Dollar stepped onto the stage of World Changers Church International, he carried himself like a man who believed he was building something far bigger than a congregation. He was constructing an empire. The atmosphere inside his Georgia megachurch was electrifying. Stadium-style seating, a full production crew, polished lighting, and a sense of expectancy that felt more like a high-profile conference than a Sunday service. Long before critics coined the phrase prosperity preacher, Dollar had already become one of its most recognizable pioneers. His message was simple and relentless: faith, obedience, and financial giving would unlock divine abundance. And as the years rolled on, that theology didn't just grow World Changers, it transformed it into a global, multi-million-dollar religious enterprise. Dollar's rise was rooted in confidence and charisma. He began with only a handful of followers in the late 1980s, preaching in a cafeteria before moving into a chapel. But as his sermons spread and his promises of supernatural financial turnaround resonated, crowds ballooned. Soon the church expanded into a massive campus, complete with administrative buildings, international broadcast facilities, and a sprawling network of satellite churches. His television program reached millions worldwide, and his books routinely hit bestseller lists. The brand of World Changers became more than a church. It became an economic force, with revenue streams flowing through media ventures, conferences, and extensive ministry operations. The wealth surrounding Creflo Dollar became part of his identity, and it drew scrutiny almost as quickly as it drew followers. Investigative reports highlighted high-value homes, luxury vehicles, and the now infamous private jets associated with the ministry. The prosperity message that powered Dollar's rise also magnified every public controversy. Critics questioned how a preacher could ask his congregation for sacrificial financial seeds, while living at a level his average member could never dream of. Yet, Dollar pushed back, insisting that prosperity was evidence of God's favor and that he modeled the blessings available to every believer. But the scrutiny didn't end with lifestyle questions. Dollar frequently defended himself against accusations that his ministry blurred the line between faith and financial coercion. The request for $65 million to fund a new ministry jet sparked nationwide backlash, prompting heated debates about ethics, transparency, and the meaning of stewardship. And though his supporters remained fiercely loyal, the controversy etched a permanent mark on his public image. Still, in an astonishing turn, none of the criticism slowed the momentum of World Changers Church International. If anything, the scrutiny only amplified Dollar's platform. He continued preaching, expanding, traveling, and building. His church maintained tens of thousands of members globally, and his ministry assets remained firmly in the multi-million-dollar range. Whether admired as a faithful visionary or criticized as the face of prosperity excess, Creflo Dollar became one of the most financially influential preachers in modern American history, proving that in the world of mega-ministries, wealth wasn't just a byproduct, it was the brand. Case 4. Kenneth Copeland. Long before the term prosperity gospel became a lightning rod in American religion, Kenneth Copeland was already shaping it into a billion-dollar ideology. His empire did not grow quietly or modestly. It expanded with the force of a corporation, built on relentless media output, global crusades, and a message that tied divine favor directly to financial abundance. A quote from Special Agent Sarah: "To understand how Copeland turned his ministry into one of the most expansive religious enterprises in modern history, you have to picture the sprawling 1,500-acre campus in Fort Worth, Texas, complete with a private airstrip, a hangar filled with aircraft, and a production studio capable of broadcasting to millions. It is a kingdom made of concrete, cameras, and cash, all orbiting around the man at its center." Copeland's rise began in the 1960s, when he shifted from aspiring musician to full-time evangelist, preaching that God wanted believers wealthy, healthy, and victorious. His early recordings and radio sermons attracted a growing base of Christians eager for a message that promised supernatural financial breakthroughs. Soon, he wasn't just preaching prosperity, he was defining it. His books, audio teachings, and televised sermons spread across the country, convincing followers that sowing seeds into his ministry would unlock divine abundance. Offering envelopes became keys to heaven's vault. Testimonies of miracle debt cancellation, unexpected wealth, and sudden promotions filled his broadcasts, creating an atmosphere where giving was never just giving, it was a holy investment with guaranteed heavenly return. As his influence grew, so did the physical footprint of Kenneth Copeland Ministries. The ministry purchased aircraft, expanded studios, built staff housing, increased programming, and launched global events that drew tens of thousands. At the peak of his reach, Copeland's broadcasts aired on nearly every major Christian television network. His 1980s and 1990s crusades transformed arenas into tornadoes of ecstatic worship, financial pledges, and declarations of prosperity. Every sermon reinforced the same idea: God blesses generosity, and the greatest harvest comes from the greatest givers. But with enormous prosperity came intense scrutiny. Journalists, watchdog groups, and government officials examined his spending, questioning how donations were being used and whether the lavish lifestyle he maintained aligned with the message he preached. The private jets, especially the infamous Gulfstream V, the mansion-like residence, the expansive ranch, and the multiple ministry-owned properties became symbols of the blurred line between spiritual leadership and extraordinary wealth. Critics accused Copeland of exploiting the hopes of struggling believers who gave sacrificially while he lived like royalty. He defended it all with a single argument: blessings were proof of God's favor. Yet, despite years of controversy, investigations, and waves of public criticism, Copeland's empire never truly faltered. His supporters remained loyal, his broadcasts continued, and his ministry campuses kept expanding. Whether seen as a titan of televangelism or the architect of a theological system that turned offerings into a commodity, Kenneth Copeland carved out one of the most financially powerful religious kingdoms in American history, and in doing so, reshaped the landscape of faith, finance, and fame in ways that still reverberate today. Case 5. Bishop Eddie Long. The story of Bishop Eddie Long unfolds with the energy and spectacle that defined New Birth Missionary Baptist Church during its meteoric rise. At its peak, walking into New Birth felt like stepping into a spiritual stadium, thousands of people flooding through the doors each week, gospel choirs shaking the rafters, and Eddie Long commanding the pulpit with the confidence of a man who believed he was reshaping the landscape of American Christianity. His sermons blended charisma, authority, and a fierce emphasis on personal success, drawing crowds so large that New Birth grew from a modest suburban church into a national powerhouse. Long didn't just preach prosperity, he packaged it, branded it, and built an empire on it. Under his leadership, New Birth ballooned into a 10,000, 25,000-member megachurch with sprawling property, corporate-style operations, major annual conferences, and partnerships that pushed Long onto the national stage as a symbol of modern Black evangelical leadership. Yet his ascent wasn't just about numbers, it was about influence. Long became a spiritual and cultural force, counseling celebrities, holding high-profile funerals, and appearing on major television networks. His ministry generated millions through conferences, media distribution, leadership programs, and aggressive expansion. New Birth's campus mirrored a corporate headquarters more than a traditional church. Multiple buildings, elite staff, and a structure that allowed Long to operate not merely as a pastor, but as the CEO of a booming Christian enterprise. Everything about the ministry screamed success, and for years, supporters saw Eddie Long as proof that faith and wealth could coexist without apology. But like so many empires built on the brilliance of a single figure, the higher Eddie Long climbed, the harder the fall would eventually become. In 2010, when lawsuits surfaced accusing him of sexual misconduct involving multiple young men from his congregation, the shock reverberated through New Birth like an earthquake. These were young men who had been part of his youth mentorship program, individuals he had publicly embraced as sons in the faith. The accusations described manipulation, grooming, and the coercive misuse of pastoral power. For supporters, it was unthinkable. For critics, it was a moment that exposed the hidden vulnerabilities of megachurch celebrity culture. Long denied the allegations, but the eventual out-of-court settlements, undisclosed but widely reported, left a permanent stain on his public legacy. The controversy didn't just tarnish his name, It rattled the financial and spiritual foundation of New Birth. Membership declined, trust fractured, and the empire he had built now had to survive without the myth of invincibility that once surrounded its leader. Eddie Long continued preaching after the scandal, but the brilliance that had defined his early career was overshadowed by the lingering cloud of accusation and betrayal. When he died in 2017, the reactions were complicated: grief, anger, loyalty, and disillusionment all converging at once. Supporters mourned a visionary leader. Critics pointed to the unresolved wounds left behind. In the end, Eddie Long's legacy sits at the intersection of spiritual ambition and economic empire building. He proved how far charisma, vision, and organizational might can take a religious leader, but his downfall revealed how quickly it can all unravel when trust is broken. His story remains one of the most dramatic examples of how a preacher can turn a church into a multi-million-dollar institution, and how scandal can bring even the most powerful ministries to their knees. Case 6. Jesse Duplantis. Long before Jesse Duplantis became one of the most polarizing figures in modern televangelism, he was already mastering the art of transforming charisma into capital. His empire didn't begin with television cameras or international stages. It started with a traveling preacher who knew how to make crowds laugh, cry, and give. But as the years passed, those crowds grew into global audiences, and his ministry evolved into a multi-million-dollar religious brand built on personality, storytelling, and a prosperity message that promised supernatural return on earthly generosity. In the heart of Louisiana, Jesse's ministry headquarters rose with the same bold confidence that defined his preaching style. Polished marble floors, expansive auditoriums, gleaming offices, and a broadcasting infrastructure that mirrored a small network were all signals of a ministry operating with significant financial horsepower. Every sermon, every televised broadcast, and every conference appearance added another layer to the sprawling enterprise. Duplantis Ministries became a familiar name not just in charismatic circles but across American religious broadcasting, where Jesse's humor-filled approach to prosperity theology attracted millions. But with empire building came scrutiny, and Jesse Duplantis quickly found himself standing at the center of one of the most heated religious controversies of the last decade. The spark came when he publicly asked supporters to fund a $54 million Falcon 7X private jet, his fourth plane, claiming it was necessary to efficiently spread the gospel. The clip went viral almost immediately. Critics blasted the request as grotesque excess, pointing to the enormous cost and the theology behind it, teachings that encouraged believers to sow financial seeds with the expectation of miraculous return. News outlets ran exposés. Late-night shows mocked it. Religious watchdogs accused him of exploiting faith for luxury. But inside his ministry, the message remained firm. This wasn't indulgence, it was kingdom business. His supporters defended him passionately, arguing that global outreach demanded global tools. And through all the public backlash, Jesse did what he had always done, leaned into his charisma, preached confidence, and presented the controversy as a misunderstanding of faith. Despite the storm, Jesse Duplantis emerged largely untouched. His ministry continued broadcasting. His conferences continued selling out. His influence across prosperity circles stayed intact. And whether admired or condemned, his empire-building legacy remains impossible to ignore. He turned storytelling, faith, and media mastery into one of the most financially powerful ministries in modern American Christianity. Case 7. Paula White-Cain. When Paula White-Cain steps onto a stage, it never feels small. The lights sharpen, the cameras tilt upward, and the crowd leans in as if waiting for a divine decree. Her voice carries a cadence polished by years of television preaching, equal parts soothing and commanding. And behind that voice sits one of the most lucrative and far-reaching ministries built by any modern preacher. Paula's rise was not quiet or gradual. It was explosive, fueled by a blend of media-savvy, prosperity-driven messaging and a fierce charisma that helped transform her name into a multi-million-dollar brand long before she ever entered the political spotlight. Her ministry empire began with simple televised sermons recorded in modest studio spaces, but almost immediately she understood something that many preachers didn't. Reach is money, and media is reach. As viewership surged, Paula White Ministries expanded into a sprawling operation with international broadcasts, best-selling books, nationwide conferences, and an ever-growing network of partners. She became known for messages promising breakthrough, abundance, elevation, and supernatural success. Teachings that resonated with millions of people who tuned in believing that her words carried the keys to transforming their lives. The revenue reflected that following. Year after year, her ministry pulled in extraordinary amounts through television donations, conference offerings, and product sales. By the mid-2000s, Paula was not just a preacher, she was a brand. But her influence did not stop at church doors or TV screens. As her popularity soared, so did her access. She became a spiritual advisor to celebrities, athletes, CEOs, and, eventually, one of the most powerful political figures in the world. Her sermons aired across major networks, her conferences filled arenas, her books cracked bestseller lists, and at every step the ministry footprint widened. More campuses, more staff, more broadcast deals, more global reach. What started as a church and TV program grew into a sophisticated enterprise with layers of revenue streams and a public profile powerful enough to shape national conversations about faith and politics. With all that visibility came criticism. For years, journalists, watchdog groups, and former insiders questioned the financial transparency of her operations. Some criticized her theology, accusing her of promoting prosperity teaching that tied spiritual breakthrough directly to giving. Others questioned the lavish lifestyle associated with her brand, the high-end properties, the designer wardrobes, the luxury travel, arguing that the image clashed with the financial strain often felt by the congregants funding the empire. Political involvement only magnified the scrutiny. Every sermon, every speech, every public appearance became ammunition for critics who believed that Paula's empire had drifted far from its original spiritual mission. But even with the controversies and heated debates, the impact of her empire is undeniable. Paula White Cain remains one of the most influential faith leaders of her era, shaping evangelical culture, dominating media platforms, and redefining how a single preacher can leverage television, branding, and political access to create a ministry worth millions. The story is a testament to the immense power of religious media and the complicated legacy that emerges when faith, fame, and money become inseparable. Case 8. Benny Hinn. From the moment Benny Hinn steps onto a stage, the atmosphere shifts into something closer to spectacle than sermon. Stadium lights sweep across thousands of raised hands, the choir swells behind him, and the crowd leans forward with a mixture of awe and expectancy. For decades, this was the signature environment that allowed Hinn to turn healing crusades into a globe-spanning empire worth millions. His white suit became iconic, his sweeping gestures instantly recognizable, and his promise of supernatural breakthrough, deliverance, and divine healing formed the emotional engine behind one of the most profitable ministries in modern religious history. Each crusade felt like a spiritual event fused with the energy of a major concert tour, broadcast worldwide, translated into multiple languages, and promoted across continents. Before he became a household name, Hinn's rise started with televised revival meetings, where he blended charismatic worship with dramatic healing demonstrations. People collapsed under his touch, wheelchairs rolled empty across the stage, and testimonies of instant cures poured in from every corner of the arena. These moments, replayed endlessly on television, helped him build a global brand that stretched across broadcasting networks, international events, and partnerships worth millions. His ministry headquarters expanded, Overseas crusades drew hundreds of thousands, and financial donations flowed in at a scale that rivaled major corporations. Charitable outreaches were highlighted constantly, reinforcing the image of a man whose ministry was changing the world through faith and miracles. But as the empire grew, so did the scrutiny. Investigative journalists, from Dateline to major Canadian outlets, began analyzing the healing claims that had made Hinn famous. They interviewed doctors, followed up on supposed miracles, and found case after case where individuals later died from the very conditions they believed had been cured. Former staff members described intense pressure behind the scenes, alleging that only certain people were allowed on stage, those who appeared convincingly healed or emotionally demonstrative. Critics argued that the ministry's financial transparency was unclear, with questions circulating about private jets, luxurious travel arrangements, and the staggering costs of international crusades funded almost entirely by donations. In the face of mounting backlash, Hinn publicly acknowledged in later years that some of his methods and teachings had grown excessive. It was a rare moment of self-reflection for a man whose ministry had defined prosperity-driven healing for an entire generation. Yet despite the controversies, legal challenges, and intense media exposés, Benny Hinn's influence never entirely faded. His empire, built on global visibility and extraordinary spectacle, reshaped the landscape of modern televangelism. And for millions of viewers around the world, he remains a symbol, whether of hope, controversy, or caution, of the immense power and peril that come with turning religion into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Case 9. Rod Parsley. Rod Parsley's rise into the world of multi-million-dollar ministry dominance began long before national broadcasters embraced his booming voice and fiery charisma. By the late 1980s, he had already transformed a small Ohio congregation into a rapidly expanding spiritual machine, one built on emotional preaching, highly produced services, and a relentless drive to broadcast his message far beyond the walls of Columbus. Viewers who tuned into his television program Breakthrough weren't just watching a pastor deliver a sermon, they were witnessing a man constructing an empire in real time. Bright lights, live audiences, dramatic music, and high-energy altar calls turned Sunday services into something that looked and felt like a national event. That momentum fueled the massive expansion that followed, propelling Parsley from local pastor to one of the most recognized evangelical figures in the country. What made Parsley's rise so notable was the scale of the infrastructure he built. World Harvest Church quickly evolved into a sprawling campus, an enormous sanctuary, a private Christian school, a Bible college, television studios, and massive administrative buildings. Each new addition signaled another level of ambition, another step toward creating a ministry structure capable of producing content, conferences, and events at a level few churches could match. Donations poured in from across the nation, especially as his broadcasts became a daily presence in millions of homes. His fiery sermons, delivered in his signature rhythm that seemed to hover somewhere between a preacher and a motivational thunderstorm, kept viewers glued to the screen, and supporters opened their wallets to fund the work they believed was divinely appointed. As his influence grew, so did the scope of his operations. Parsley launched annual conferences that attracted tens of thousands of attendees, built networks with national political figures, and expanded his broadcasting reach through satellite television and international partnerships. His ministry's operating budget soared into the millions as World Harvest became one of the most formidable evangelical power centers in the Midwest. Students filled his Bible college, young ministers trained under his leadership, and families relocated across the country to be part of the community he had built. To his followers, Parsley was not merely a pastor, he was a visionary, constructing a kingdom-sized institution with global reach. But with such rapid expansion came scrutiny, and over the years Parsley found himself at the center of controversy. Critics accused him of blending hyper-charismatic theology with prosperity-style appeals, raising financial questions about ministry spending, and pushing emotionally intense fundraising methods that made supporters feel obligated to give. Investigations into the church's handling of certain internal matters, including the costly lawsuit involving the World Harvest Christian Academy, raised concerns about governance and accountability. While not criminal scandals, the financial settlements and public criticism chipped away at the perfectly polished image of a ministry powered entirely by divine blessing. Despite this, Parsley's empire endured. His broadcasts continued, his conferences filled arenas, his ministry footprint remained enormous. Even when critics argued that World Harvest had become more of an economic powerhouse than a spiritual sanctuary, his supporters praised him for using every tool available, media, education, publishing, production, to spread the gospel on a global scale. And in many ways, that duality is exactly what defines Rod Parsley's legacy. A pastor who built one of the most financially and structurally ambitious Christian enterprises in the United States, weathering controversies without losing the loyalty of the followers who believed in his vision. Case 10. Joyce Meyer. Long before Joyce Meyer became one of the most recognizable faces in modern Christian broadcasting, she was a small group Bible teacher speaking to a handful of women in a church basement. But as the years progressed, her voice grew louder, her presence sharper, and her message, built around emotional healing, spiritual authority, and practical faith, began resonating with millions. The rise wasn't accidental. It was strategic, relentless, and fueled by a combination of charismatic delivery, television syndication, and a deep understanding of how personal storytelling could build an empire. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Joyce Meyer Ministries had transformed into a global powerhouse, capable of filling convention centers, producing best-selling books, and generating enormous revenue from media distribution and international outreach. Her broadcast, Enjoying Everyday Life, became the backbone of the ministry's expansion. It aired morning, afternoon, and late at night, flooding homes around the world with her distinctive cadence and practical Christian self-help message. Donations began pouring in, book sales skyrocketed, and every major conference drew tens of thousands of attendees. With that level of success came the infrastructure of a full-fledged corporate empire, a sprawling headquarters in Missouri, hundreds of employees, global humanitarian operations, and a distribution network capable of moving millions of books and teaching materials each year. The machinery was enormous and expensive, but it worked. Joyce Meyer's brand became synonymous with polished excellence and relentless reach. Yet with that kind of financial power came scrutiny. Investigative journalists, watchdog groups, and critics began questioning the ministry's spending practices, pointing to high salaries, corporate jets, and the construction of a multi-million-dollar headquarters outfitted with luxury furnishings. Meyer defended the expenditures by emphasizing the scale of the global operation and the necessity of excellence in ministry infrastructure. Supporters agreed, seeing her success as evidence of God's favor and the impact of her teaching, but critics argued it was one more example of prosperity-style excess disguised as spiritual stewardship. The tension between perception and intent became a defining thread in public discussions about her ministry. Despite the criticism, Joyce Meyer weathered every storm. She tightened financial policies, adopted new accountability standards, and continued expanding her reach. Today, her ministry still operates on a massive scale. Global broadcasts, international missions, best-selling books, and conferences that attract audiences in the thousands. Her influence stretches across continents, shaping both modern charismatic teaching and the business model of the contemporary megachurch. And whether viewed as a pioneering communicator or a symbol of Christian celebrity culture, Joyce Meyer remains one of the most powerful figures in the landscape of faith-based media, proving that once a church transforms into an empire, it rarely shrinks back to a simple pulpit and a modest congregation. Case 11. Frederick K.C. Price. When Frederick walked onto the stage of Crenshaw Christian Center's Faith Dome, it wasn't just another Sunday service. It was the unveiling of one of the most ambitious church expansions in American history. The Faith Dome itself stood as a declaration of Price's vision, a 10,000-seat architectural marvel rising out of south-central Los Angeles, gleaming like a monument to faith, perseverance, and the extraordinary financial engine his ministry had become. To the thousands who filled the dome each week, Price wasn't simply a pastor. He was a commanding figure whose teachings on faith for finances shaped an entire generation of believers who saw prosperity not as a luxury, but as a divine promise. Price began with a small congregation in the 1970s, preaching simple sermons about trust and spiritual discipline. But his break came when he discovered the growing wave of faith-based television. He leaned into it immediately, recognizing that a camera could take his message far beyond California. As the broadcast ministry expanded, so did the revenue. Donations poured in from across the United States, fueling rapid growth. New buildings, national conferences, and the purchase of expansive property that transformed Crenshaw Christian Center into one of the most recognizable megachurches in the country. The Faith Dome, completed in 1989, became the centerpiece of this empire, a place where Price preached with absolute confidence that God intended believers not just to survive, but to flourish. Yet with influence came scrutiny. Critics accused Price of excessive prosperity teaching, arguing that his focus on financial blessing encouraged a transactional view of faith. Documentaries and investigative reports questioned the immense operational budget behind the ministry and the optics of a massive dome, rising in a community struggling with poverty and systemic inequality. Price dismissed such criticisms with unwavering resolve, insisting that the Faith Dome was a testament to what belief, combined with discipline, could accomplish. He was never shy about confronting his detractors, often calling them out directly from the pulpit, reinforcing the idea that his ministry was not built on exploitation but on conviction. Despite controversy, the impact of Price's empire was undeniable. He trained leaders, launched schools, and built a nationally recognized Bible teaching program that shaped countless ministries across the country. Even as debates about prosperity theology raged on, Crenshaw Christian Center continued expanding its outreach, solidifying Price as one of the most influential megachurch pastors of the late 20th century. By the time he passed his leadership mantle to his son, the empire he built was fully established, a multi-million-dollar institution with a legacy that continues to spark conversation, admiration, and criticism all at once. Case 12. Robert Morris. When you step into Gateway Church in Southlake, Texas, you immediately sense that this is not an ordinary place of worship. It feels more like a finely tuned corporate headquarters fused with a modern worship arena, humming with activity, lights, staff, and the unmistakable machinery of a large-scale institution. And at the center of it stands Robert Morris, a soft-spoken yet commanding figure whose influence spreads across multiple campuses, national broadcasts, leadership networks, and one of the most financially powerful megachurch systems in modern American Christianity. His rise wasn't driven by loud theatrics or flamboyant showmanship. Instead, Morris built an empire through calculated expansion, strategic leadership culture, and an unapologetic theology of generosity that mobilized an enormous donor base and positioned Gateway as one of the most well-funded churches in the nation. The story begins in 2000, when Morris launched Gateway Church in his living room with just a handful of people. What happened over the next 2 decades was nothing short of explosive. Attendance surged into the tens of thousands. New campuses appeared with astonishing speed. Multi-million-dollar construction projects unfolded, including the flagship Southlake campus, an enormous state-of-the-art facility with an expansive worship center, headquarters, studios, leadership school, and sprawling administrative wings. Gateway's annual budget soon climbed into the tens of millions, allowing Morris to hire hundreds of staff members and build out robust departments ranging from media broadcasting to pastoral care, counseling, education, worship production, and national leadership training initiatives. Under his stewardship, Gateway became not just a church but a brand, one associated with polished production, tightly organized leadership structures, and a financial foundation that rivaled some corporations. Central to Morris's empire was his authoritative messaging on giving, tithing, and what he called the blessed life. His sermons on generosity, especially his insistence that God blesses those who give sacrificially, became wildly popular. Thousands of churches around the world adopted his materials. His book, The Blessed Life, became a bestseller and a core teaching tool within the church, reinforcing the idea that financial obedience was directly tied to spiritual favor. For supporters, these teachings were inspirational and transformative. For critics, they were the theological engine that fueled an ever-growing financial machine. Either way, the results were undeniable. Gateway's donation streams surged, allowing for relentless expansion and long-term financial strength. But with great influence came great scrutiny. Over the years, Gateway faced intense criticism for its spending habits, financial transparency, and what some perceived as lavish operational budgets. The church made headlines in 2017 when Morris announced they were facing a significant financial shortfall. Shocking news to many who viewed Gateway as financially untouchable. While the church framed it as a season of strategic restructuring, critics pointed to the sheer size of the organization and the long-term sustainability of such rapid expansion. Others questioned Morris's teachings on tithing, arguing that the pressure placed on members contributed to a culture where financial giving was tied directly to spiritual worth and divine favor. Though no criminal financial wrongdoing was ever alleged, the conversation around Gateway's size, spending, and financial expectations became part of the broader national discourse about megachurch economics. Despite the controversies, the empire Morris built continued to thrive. Gateway remained one of the most influential megachurches in the country, shaping pastors, leaders, and congregations nationwide through conferences, online programs, satellite campuses, and partnerships. Even during seasons when Morris stepped back due to health issues, the infrastructure he created, the staff, the network, the brand, was strong enough to function independently. That is the true measure of the empire he constructed, not just numbers or buildings, but a system capable of sustaining itself even when its founder isn't on stage. Robert Morris's story is a defining chapter in the evolution of American megachurches. Through disciplined organization, bold expansion, and teachings that resonated across the country, he built a spiritual empire with enormous financial and cultural reach. Supporters see him as a visionary. Critics see him as an architect of the modern prosperity-driven church model. But no matter which side you're on, one fact is undeniable. Gateway Church stands as one of the most successful and financially powerful church institutions in the nation, and Robert Morris is the mind that shaped it. Case 13. Bill Johnson. When you step into Redding, California, it doesn't take long to feel the gravitational pull of Bethel Church. It's not just a congregation, it's an entire ecosystem, a spiritual brand recognized in nearly every corner of the charismatic Christian world. At the center of it stands Bill Johnson, a soft-spoken pastor whose sermons about miracles, revival, and the supernatural helped transform a once local church into a multi-million-dollar global enterprise. Bethel didn't grow through traditional means. It expanded through a carefully cultivated identity. Revival culture, worship music, healing rooms, global schools of ministry, and a media presence that rivaled major Christian networks. By the time outsiders realized just how large Bethel had become, it was no longer a church, it was an industry. Johnson's rise was quiet at first. When he took leadership in the late 1990s, Bethel was just another regional charismatic church. But he envisioned something far bigger. A training center that would shape future leaders, musicians, and missionaries with a theology centered on signs, wonders, and supernatural power. Under his guidance, the Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry exploded in enrollment. Students from dozens of countries poured into Reading, paying thousands each year to learn prophecy, healing techniques, and revival leadership. Meanwhile, Bethel music became a global powerhouse, dominating Christian charts, selling out tours, and generating millions through albums, licensing, and streaming. With every new success, Bethel's financial footprint expanded. Real estate purchases, ministry buildings, conferences drawing tens of thousands, and a worldwide network of partner churches. But with growth came scrutiny. Reports criticized Bethel's finances, its influence over the city of Reading, and the revenue generated from its ministry school and music empire. Controversies surrounding miracle claims, faith-healing attempts gone wrong, and the church's involvement in local politics brought national attention. Critics questioned whether revival culture had evolved into a highly profitable brand, fueled as much by emotional experiences and global music sales as by spiritual conviction. Each wave of controversy seemed to reinforce the same tension, a movement proclaiming supernatural impact while simultaneously operating one of the most successful ministry businesses on the planet. Yet despite the criticism, Bethel's momentum barely slowed. Conferences continued to sell out, albums topped charts, students kept enrolling, and Bill Johnson remained the steady, unflinching figure at the center of it all. Whether viewed as a visionary ushering in spiritual renewal or a leader presiding over a carefully packaged empire, one thing is undeniable. He helped turn Bethel Church into one of the most influential and financially powerful ministry brands in modern history. Case 14, Brian Houston. By the time Brian Houston stepped onto the brightly lit stage of a packed arena, framed by booming music, global branding, and a ministry machine that spanned continents, Hillsong had already evolved far beyond a local Australian church. It had become a worldwide phenomenon. Part concert, part corporation, part spiritual movement. The scale of it all was staggering. Millions of albums sold, some of the most influential worship anthems in modern Christianity, conferences filling stadiums across nations, and a global network of campuses generating multi-million-dollar annual revenue. Hillsong wasn't just a church. It was a brand, an empire, a cultural force. And at the center stood Brian Houston, its architect. Houston's rise began with simple roots. His father, Frank Houston, founded a modest Pentecostal congregation, but it was Brian who saw the bigger picture. He understood instinctively the power of music, media, and global storytelling. Under his leadership, Hillsong mastered the art of turning worship into a global export. Hillsong United, Young and Free, and Hillsong Worship became international sensations, performing on world tours and topping charts. Every song, every sermon, every conference fed the momentum, and with each year, Hillsong's financial footprint expanded. New campuses purchased buildings outright, international branches entered multi-million-dollar leases, and the ministry quietly accumulated vast assets, spread across multiple countries. As the movement grew, so did Brian Houston's influence. He became a go-to voice for celebrity conversions, political conversations, and national moments of crisis. His books became bestsellers. His conferences doubled as leadership training events and massive income generators. Corporate partnerships, publishing deals, international distribution agreements, all of it funneled into the Hillsong machine. For years, it appeared unstoppable. But with worldwide influence comes worldwide scrutiny, and the Hillsong empire found itself increasingly under a microscope. Questions surfaced about financial transparency and the sheer volume of money flowing through the ministry. Critics pointed to the luxurious lifestyles associated with some leaders, the expensive properties tied to ministry branches, and the internal structure that placed enormous power in the hands of a small executive circle. The more Hillsong grew, the more critics alleged that it operated with the precision of a corporation rather than a congregation. Then came an avalanche of scandals, some tied to leaders in various global campuses, others connected directly to Brian Houston's handling of past allegations surrounding his father. The controversies sparked investigations, news specials, documentaries, and widespread debate about accountability in megachurch culture. Brian Houston eventually stepped down amid mounting legal and public pressure, creating one of the most dramatic leadership falls in modern church history. Yet even with the turbulence, the financial reality remained. Hillsong was, and still is, a global religious empire. The brand continues to operate internationally, the music still charts, and the ministry's assets and influence remain vast. Brian Houston's legacy is complex, part visionary, part empire builder, part cautionary tale, but there is no denying the impact. As one of the most influential architects of modern megachurch culture, he helped shape an industry where faith, media, and multi-million-dollar systems intersect, leaving behind a blueprint that continues to echo across global Christianity today. Case 15. Carlton Pearson. By the time Carlton Pearson reached the height of his influence in the 1990s, he stood at the center of one of the most dynamic and rapidly growing ministries in the United States. Higher Dimensions Church in Tulsa wasn't just a congregation, it was a full-scale spiritual enterprise, drawing in thousands each week, broadcasting internationally, and hosting conferences that pulled in believers and church leaders from across the country. Everything about Pearson's ministry felt expansive. The music, the sermons, the media reach, and the financial engine driving it all. From the outside, it looked like a blueprint for how a preacher could build a modern religious empire, part spiritual movement, part cultural phenomenon, and part sophisticated organization humming with momentum. What set Pearson apart in those early years was his charisma. He had a preacher's rhythm, a singer's ear, and a storyteller's instinct. Crowds didn't just listen to him, they felt him. As Higher Dimensions swelled to over 5,000 members, revenue followed naturally. Best-selling albums, television appearances, conferences, and partnerships that turned the ministry into a multi-million-dollar operation. Pearson became a featured guest on major networks, a rising star within the Pentecostal world, and a trusted voice among Black evangelical leaders nationwide. His empire was built on a combination of talent, timing, and the infectious optimism that defined every sermon he preached. But Pearson's story took a historic and controversial turn when he announced a radical shift in his theology. He publicly rejected the idea of eternal damnation and began preaching what he called the gospel of inclusion, a belief that challenged foundational doctrines within the evangelical world. This wasn't a quiet shift, nor was it wrapped gently in academic language. Pearson preached it boldly, unapologetically, and with the same confidence that had once built his empire. But this time, the message fractured more than it united. Almost overnight, support evaporated. Networks distanced themselves. Fellow pastors who had once shared conference stages with him issued public rebukes. Higher Dimensions, once overflowing, began shrinking rapidly as members left in confusion, frustration, or outright fear that their church's theology had become spiritually unstable. Revenue dried up, influence plummeted, and the multi-million-dollar ministry Pearson had spent decades building began to collapse under the weight of doctrinal backlash. The consequences were both financial and deeply personal. The loss of membership forced major downsizing. Staff were let go, buildings were sold. What had been a thriving religious empire was suddenly fighting for survival, and Pearson, once one of America's most celebrated Pentecostal leaders, found himself standing alone, clinging to a message that cost him everything he had built. And yet, in an ironic twist, his downfall cemented his legacy. Whether praised or condemned, his story became a permanent part of modern American religious history, a dramatic example of how quickly a megachurch empire can rise and how brutally it can fall when its leader steps into theological territory the institution is not willing to follow. When you step back and look at all 15 of these stories side by side, you see a picture much bigger than individual personalities or isolated ministries. You see the rise of an entirely new era in modern Christianity, one built on media power, global branding, and the kind of financial influence that would have been unimaginable to preachers just a generation earlier. Each of these leaders didn't just build a church, they built an institution, a machine, an empire, capable of shaping culture, politics, and the spiritual imagination of millions. And whether their names inspire admiration or criticism, their impact is undeniable. From arena-sized sanctuaries to international broadcasting networks, from best-selling books to multi-million-dollar campuses, each one transformed faith into a global enterprise whose reach extends far beyond Sunday morning sermons. But as massive as these empires became, one question lingers beneath the sheer scale of it all. How much is too much? At what point does spiritual influence become commercial power? And where does the line fall between genuine ministry and a meticulously engineered brand? For some viewers, these ministries represent hope, encouragement, and inspiration. For others, they serve as reminders of how quickly faith can be shaped, and sometimes overshadowed, by wealth, celebrity, and the relentless pursuit of expansion. Yet the one thing every viewer can agree on is this: these stories force you to look at the modern religious landscape with clearer eyes, recognizing both its possibilities and its pitfalls. Now I want to hear from you. Out of all 15 preachers featured in this documentary, which empire shocked you the most, and why? Was it the sheer size, the money, the global influence, or something else entirely? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's dig into it together.